I'll let you know when I'm finished.
Okay.
So once again, thank you 394 for agreeing to do this debate. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming here to listen to this debate. I'm going to just take it for granted that this discussion is not about what we ought to do about races. Um, it's just about if racism itself is genetically hardwired or not. Um, so regarding what we should do about racism is not within the scope of this debate. So I'd like to set the conditions I think are necessary to prove the proposition racism is genetically hardwired to be true. In order for racism to be genetically hardwired, then race encoding would need to be ubiquitous. Race encoding is not ubiquitous, therefore racism is not genetically hardwired. I will grant that discrimination may be genetically hardwired, but discrimination is not the same as racism, and the coalition affiliations themselves are not genetically hardwired. They are socially contingent. Additionally, if racism is genetically hardwired, then that would mean it is unlikely a person would stop being racist. Genetically hardwired racism means people would need to encode the race of people they interact with. That encoding would need to be non-contingent on historical context in order for it to be genetic, which means if you isolate the co-founding historical contingency, then you would see the same results, that being racism. As it turns out, one such experiment was done to isolate these co-founding historical contingencies, and the opposite was found. People's racial encoding disappeared with presented with as little as 4 minutes of an alternate social encoding. Imagine what wonders a lifetime of alternate social encoding would do. If if racism is genetically hardwired, then we would see racism in feral children who are not part of our social systems. It would be immutable, meaning it cannot be changed. And the encoding of racism itself would also be genetically hardwired. So, in order for my opponent to affirm the proposition that racism is genetically hardwired, they would need to demonstrate one, that racial encoding is hardwired. Two, that racial encoding is universal, meaning we see it in every culture. And three, that racial encoding cannot be mitigated in any social way. Because those three conditions cannot be met, and there is evidence in support of the opposite position, you should vote for the negation of the proposition that racism is genetically hardwired. And that's the end of my opening statement.
Okay. Thank you. I really appreciated your opening statement. So the first thing I wanted to center on is I think you said that racial encoding wasn't present, as in there aren't different races. Is that what you were talking about?
Racial encoding would have to be genetically hardwired in order for racism to be genetically hardwired.
So you're saying that people aren't genetically different enough to say that there are different races.
No, what I'm saying is that that someone has to, that all people around the planet would have to see race and encode race without any type of social factor making it a fact.
Okay. So to go off of that, and also your thing, you talked about how you would have to have evidence of children being able to be racist without social hardwiring as well, right?
Sorry, ask that question again.
So you said you needed evidence as well of children not being socially hardwired or infants.
Feral children.
So like what exactly is feral in what sense?
A feral child is a child who is like abandoned by their parents. So they typically don't speak a language. They don't have any social customs because they weren't raised in a society. There are famous examples of like some being raised by wolves, and all of their behaviors are like a wolf. So if it is genetically hardwired, then something like a human outside of society would have the genetic racism already part of them. So because we don't see examples of feral children having racism, then we can't say it's genetically hardwired.
Hmm. So would it be possible that the child wouldn't even know what the concept of race really was? So it would be hard for wait. So basically you're saying that a feral child would have to prefer one race over another without having been raised by one race or another.
Um, it's not just, I don't know what you mean by prefer a race over another there.
Like, they have a bias towards that race, they prefer more to talk with that race, they make more eye contact with that race. Anything kind of like there was a study done that I referenced, I think it was a couple days ago, where infant children, I think it was they were about 6 months old, um,
Hmm.
innately preferred one race over another. So, say their mom was white, they tended to prefer or, they were raised around well, usually it's said in the article that children are more likely to 90% of their time is around a similar race. Or 90% of the people they are surrounded by are of a similar race, so they tend to prefer that race, even though they didn't have any of the social conditioning, how
Well, hold
people
on. You said 90% of the time they're around the same race, but that is
Mhm.
social conditioning. That's being in a social context where 90% of their interactions are the same race. You have to isolate that in order to demonstrate your claim.
What if there was a case where somebody had a disorder that kept them from being able to identify more with the race? Would that prove that at least racism was somewhat socially hardwired because there could be a
Well,
genetic deficiency that
socially socially hardwired isn't the proposition, it's genetically hardwired.
right, so say they had some genetic malfunction that kept them from being able to identify with a race in the first place, would
Mhm.
that mean then that genetically they were being influenced to be able to identify with a certain race?
No, because as I granted in my opening statement, discrimination based on affiliations of groups might be hardwired, and that can be damaged. But the affiliation itself is not hardwired. So the inability to view coalitions of people and have biases based on those coalitions would not demonstrate that it is genetically hardwired. It would just that racism is genetically hardwired. All it would do is just demonstrate that we found a part of the brain where discrimination exists as a capability, not racism itself. And I don't take ethnicity to be identical to race. So that's a conflation that we would need to clear up here. Just identifying more strongly or having a bias with a certain ethnicity is not racism. Racism has to do with groups of ethnicities that share certain features.
Right, like, I'm not saying, like, a Romanian child versus a French child would show more, uh would care more if the person was Romanian or French or nationalities kind of, just like they're of the European subsect, basically, or,
Right,
like,
but even
Hispanic.
even the even the view of white race versus black race is problematic because the genetic diversity between people in Ireland is versus people in Ireland compared to people in Italy is greater than people in Italy compared to those in Northern Africa, but people in Northern Africa and Italy are considered to be different races
I hadn't heard of that. You're saying people in Italy are closer to people in North Africa?
than Ireland, yeah.
Hmm.
And the genetic diversity between the races is not as great as people assume they are. So not only if you're going to rely on race naturalism, I need an argument for race being genetic rather than being a social categorization that people have chosen.
Yeah, I can totally bring that up. Just one second.
while we're doing this, what do you define race to be?
Race is genetic differences, such as there's a difference between, for example, like genetically, there's a huge difference between, say, Europeans and Africans, and North Africans versus who commonly are more likely to be like related to Middle Easterners. Like Egypt is part of Africa, yet they're
That's not, wait, genetic differences aren't the only thing that indicates race. Like it might be sufficient, but or it might be a necessary thing that it's genetic for that definition. But I am a ginger. I am genetically different than the vast majority of people in Europe because of this
Mhm,
mutation of my genes. I am white, but there's a big genetic difference that I have. So much so that I
mhm,
need more anesthesia than people who aren't gingers. That I'm the highest risk for skin cancer. I produce way more vitamin D than other people. My pain reception is different. I have greater acid on my skin. There's this thing called an acid mantle, which is a pH balance of your skin. Mine is way higher than other white people. All of those things are really big genetic differences. But I am
mhm,
white. Genetic differences aren't just the thing that makes something a race. I need something more than that because I have great genetic differences from other white people, but I'm still white.
mhm. So for example, here, um, I'll just go ahead and link it into the post chat.
Mhm.
Um, sorry, I'm like, so basically, it looks like there are about 4 different clusters that have been found according to this research paper. And I'll go ahead and link the research paper. So basically what it's saying is what I was talking about race is I was talking about subjects identified them as belonging to one of 4 major races and were recruited from 15 different geographic locales. And genetic cluster analysis of the microsatellite markers produced 4 major clusters, which showed near perfect correspondence of the 4 self-reported race ethnicity categories. So what I was talking about were more clusters,
Right, but
not just
hold on.
like
There are clusters of gingers. Gingers would identify as a ginger, which would be distinct from the other population, and there would be genetic clusters that we could find and would point it out. So
not just
why does this
sorry.
genetic variation lead to a different race? Like it seems to me that race is not just genetic variation, but it's pointing out certain categories. And
Well, even if oh, sorry.
no, you're fine. You can go ahead.
I mean, even if you look at genetically, even if you're ginger, you still will align more or with a certain race. Like, for example, there's going to be a genetic difference. You're not going to be super you're going to be more genetically close to, say, someone who is European than, say, if there was a mixed race child who ended up having both African and European ancestry who turned out to be ginger.
Wait, what do you mean more genetically diverse? How do you know that?
Because they had more genetic components that just came from the European pool. Because I'm assuming, like, you're not mixed
Wait,
race.
but no, no, no. That's repeating the claim. I'm asking you, you said there's greater genetic diversity between me and say an African versus me and a European. Okay,
N
what
yes.
what is that genetic diversity? I'd like to see some information about that genetic diversity between the two races there. Not just you're just repeating the claim if you're going to say, well, genetic diversity means that there's going to be more variation in your gene code relative to someone from Africa versus someone from Europe. That
No,
just
that's not what I meant. I meant,
okay.
like, even though you do have genes for a ginger, you're still gonna be closer to one specific cluster than
I
another.
I understand. That's the claim. I'm asking for evidence of that claim.
Okay.
I understand what genetic variation is. I understand the standard that you're saying here would show that there's a different race, but I want to
Uh-huh.
see some evidence that gingers are going to have greater like genetic homology with someone from Europe over someone from Africa.
Mm-hmm. So you want me to basically prove.
I want you to substantiate the claim you made, which is there's greater genetic diversity between myself and an African versus myself and a European.
Okay.
Because what's at stake here is not just simply like categories that we create socially and then we find evidence of those categories, because there's a genetic test to show gingers are out there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a genetic test for height, for hair color, for eye color, but we don't group people who have blue eyes as a distinct race. There's something more to race than just genetic variation.
Okay.
So I want some empirical evidence that race is not just something in social concepts only, that it's not a social construct. That's what I'm looking
But I
for here.
showed you I showed you the paper saying that there were 4 different clusters among Asians, Hispanics,
Mhm.
whites, and blacks.
Right. Those clusters don't prove race, that just prove genetic variation. Like we can cluster in different ways. I could show you papers on brown hair being a different gene than blonde hair. But that
Right,
doesn't
but
tell me that blondes are a different race than brown-haired people. I need something more than just genetic variation, because humans are incredibly diverse all around the planet with lots of different types of genetic variation.
right.
So
One
you need to talk about something like there's this gene that only exists in this group and we don't see it in other groups.
right, 1 second.
And it doesn't have to be like one gene, it can be sets of genes, but that diversity, the homology between the races needs to be greater than within the race itself. So you need to
Mhm.
show that the homology between races is greater than within the race itself. That's an important feature in order for it to be genetically distinct. But
Okay.
it's also a little bit off topic for the proposition, because even if race is natural, it wouldn't mean that racism is genetically hardwired.
Mhm. Wait 1 second. I found something that goes into genetic clustering of the white race. But it's not loading. Just 1 second.
And what do you take the white race to be?
Well, for instance, um, the Celts, Germanics, and I believe the Iberians, which is constitutes France and or also even Slavs. That would be a genetic cluster within the white race.
Okay, so you live in the United States, right?
Sure, yeah.
Do you consider people from the Middle East to be white?
No, because they're more closely
Do you
related
know
to
what the US Census considers people from the Middle East to be?
Caucasian, but
Yes, they're
not.
white. That's white.
No,
Yes.
people from India are not white.
Not on the US Census, they're not considered Caucasian. There's a separate category from people from India.
Yes, but
So
in
The US Census has defined as part of the white race as Middle Eastern, but you don't accept that as the white race. So the
you're act
definition of white race does not even have a consensus here. So there's a problem with what it means to be white. So you can
well,
appeal to these You can appeal to these genetic clusters of Europeans being different from Arabic people, but people in from the Middle East are considered white based on the US Census.
Yes, the US Census, but genetically they're more different than us than say an Irish person is far closer to a German person than someone from India is close
Right, but do
to.
you know when race started? Like when race emerged as a concept in our culture?
First, would you look at the genetic cluster that I just produced showing that there are genetic clusters among even Northern Europeans?
Right, but we don't call those races. So even though there's genetic clusters between Norwegians and Germans and Irish and Celtic and Italian, those aren't races. That's talking about ethnicity. We see genetic clusters of ethnicity. Ethnicity is not the same as race. Race is a collection of ethnicities. This is the conflation I was very worried about coming up in the debate. All you've demonstrated is that there are genetic clusters of ethnicity.
And
Now,
within those 4 clusters, there are genetic differences, right?
yes,
So, for
and do you
example,
remember the standard I'd asked you to meet earlier about the genetic diversity between the ethnicities in one race?
and I produced it. I
No,
literally.
I asked you to show me the diversity between one race being less than the diversity between different races. So
Okay,
you showed the genetic diversity between Europeans or people who are white. Now, I need to see that this genetic diversity is
okay,
less than the genetic diversity than say like someone from Italy and someone from Northern Africa.
okay, let me get it really fast. I know what you're talking about. Just let me produce it really quick. Here it is. Um, so essentially this graph is showing that these different races are like totally separate from each other, even within their own ethnicities. So there is
Hold
like,
on. What are the races being picked out by this image?
well, so for example, it looks like one is Kenyan or South Africa is the
Kenya is
orange.
not a race,
No, I'm right, but it's talking about genetic clusters from within um Kenya.
but Kenyan is not a race. You need to demonstrate how this GIF that you just posted correlates with the races that we talk about: black, white, Asian. How does this demonstrate the genetic diversity between black and white?
Well, for example,
Wait, you posted the GIF. I expect you to know what the GIF is demonstrating. You claimed it
it
demonstrates this genetic diversity. How does it demonstrate that?
it demonstrates it because, for example, it demonstrates the clusters that I was talking about: white, black, Hispanic, Asian. You can clearly see that.
Where are the clusters?
Well, in each part of the graph, for example, up at the top says Africa, so clearly that's
Mhm.
very, very different from, say, Eskimo, which is closer to the bottom, which is the blue, or even South America. So it shows there's a very large genetic difference between, say, Africa and South America. Even showed up above that there were four genetic clusters that the researchers found, which were African, Hispanic, white, and
Self-identified,
black.
self-identified genetic clusters. But I'm not asking for, look, this is just repeating the claim that there's genetic variation. I want comparisons of the genetic variation. I want to see the greater differences between these races. So it seems to me like you're saying this graph is showing the difference between like Africa and like the Clovis people, right? Is that your claim?
Yeah, and look how much Africa is the very top. Clearly, there's a huge difference between Clovis and Spanish. And here, okay, I found something which you'll be very interested in.
Right, but do you see all that stuff in the middle? All of
Yeah,
those things in the middle? So those things, those peoples would be considered different races, but the homology is quite similar.
then from Africa. And you said that there was a greater, that you said, for example, Italians were closer to Africa than
Mhm.
to people in s- somewhere
Right, but
else.
Africa is filled with tons of different ethnicities, right? So when it says Africa here, what parts of Africa are being talked about there? Like how far away is the farthest away from the Clovis people? And what studies does this come from? Because I'd like to see the methodology.
Okay.
Just showing me this GIF here where there's like a big line up and a big line down doesn't demonstrate that Northern Italians have greater homology with Northern Africans than they do with Irish people.
I would think it would be Southern Italians because that's closer
Yeah,
to
sorry,
North
Southern
Africa.
Italian. Well, no, just Italians in general. I don't think it really matters. But
It
we can
does.
go with Southern Italians. We can go with Southern Italians. That's fine. So you need to show that the diversity, but the homology between Southern Italians is more similar to Northern Europeans than Northern Africans.
Okay. I should have prepared more stuff for this because I was thinking more along the lines of like in-group preference and that kind of stuff concerning
Well,
race.
that's different than racism. In-group preference is not the same as racism. Racism has to do with preference for categories of many ethnicities, not just like discrimination based on an ethnicity.
Well, I mean, going along like race, I guess I was concerning race with
Ethnicity.
physical attributes as well.
Right. But so like I'm fine granting that race has to do with physical attributes. I think that's what people mean when they use race. They're talking about phenotypes. They're talking about the way people look. So there's an obvious difference between someone who's white and someone who's black, their skin color. There are other obvious differences like eye color, um, the way the hair grows, all of that stuff. Those things are phenotypes. I'm fine granting that that's what people mean when they say race, but the boundaries of race aren't so hard determined. What determines a race is culturally relative. Because race is a culturally relative term, that goes to my argument that race is not ubiquitous, but ethnicity or discrimination might be. And I'll also point out that this idea of genes and race is a relatively new phenomenon. We developed the ideas of race before we had genetic testing, before we had biology.
Mhm. Mostly
So
based
what
on
happened is
phenotypes, like you said.
we had concepts of race that had to do with something like essences. In the time period it came about, people thought that personality was related to some type of essence, some type of spiritual essence. And so there would be like an essence of being Celtic, an essence of being English, an essence of being
Mhm.
German. And so those types of essences had certain advantages and disadvantages. And then when European colonialism took off, people tried to categorize that, thinking about different types of people being sort of essences, some type of spiritual essence, because Europeans were predominantly dualist. Those essences then just became these bigger categories called race. So people who
Mhm.
are of this cluster of race had the same essence. But then we learned about biology and we are like, wait a minute, essence is weird. That doesn't make any sense.
Mhm.
There's no backing for something like essence. So what's happened is we have this old school definition of what race is, which is some type of spiritual essence based on Aristotelian views, that then got reappropriated with genes. Okay, so then we have people looking at genes to see if like what we were observing with these essences actually maps on to some kind of biology. And we find that doesn't really pan out the way we think racism does. Our concept of
Mhm.
racism doesn't match the reality of the genes. Okay, so then we can try and change what a race is, and we can maybe have smaller groupings of people and have larger views of race. Like we might have more races than the old world races, which was something like five.
Mhm.
Okay, so we can just, we can just grant that like there would be some type of genetic factor for these differences in ethnicity. And we can just grant, for the sake of argument, that these genetic factors might correlate with these old world observations that European colonialists had. I'll also point out that there these this concept of like these five races that Europe came up with is not the same conception that say they had in China about race and ethnicity. They also grouped people based on phenotypes, but that's not the same as race. Race is a specific type of categorization where it's a collection of many ethnicities that share certain phenotypes. It's not just ethnicities. So I want to be very clear that discrimination based on an ethnicity, while people might use it as racism, it is not discrimination based on race, but based on ethnicity. So just so we're clear that we don't conflate those things.
Right, and like I said, scientists did prove there were 4 genetic clusters which could denote race. Within those are different ethnicities. Like, say, Iranians and um, French people are within the same race, but they're different ethnicities.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you understood what I just said. I'm saying we can just grant that there would be something like a race here.
Anyways, the reason why I said why racism, my main argument for racism being genetically hardwired would be for people to be able to form groups around those who look like themselves so that they would be able to defend from others who aren't part of their group, which has traditionally been the way that people were able to survive.
Right, but that survival is based on social contingency. You're not arguing for social contingency here. You're arguing for genetically hardwired.
Mhm.
People forming affiliations based on other people looking the same might be hardwired. I'm granted that from the opening statement. Of course, humans are going to group people as a heuristic as a means of survival. Whenever we were in this tribal mode of living, we were moving around, we were hunting. When we came across other groups of people, we needed a very fast way to determine if they were friend or foe. One of
Mhm.
the ways we did that was with something like ethnicity. Another way we do that, and we still do it today, is something like the way people dress, the types of hairstyles people have. Our
Mhm.
militaries have different uniforms so that they can identify friend from foe. So it's hardwired that humans as would use something like visual appearance to make snap judgments about other people that they don't know. What is
That's a
not hardwired is this notion of race itself.
Okay, the argument I was originally going for was just that our ability, say, white people and black people, they tend to choose each other instead of, I mean, instead of the other, just because it's hardwired within them to form that group preference based off of phenotypic differences.
Group preference isn't the same as racism, though. And
How are
ethnicity is not the
not
same as racism. Ethnicity is not the same as racism.
right, but how are the two not connected that,
Them
for
being connected
example,
is not the same as genetically hardwired.
because everyone always talks about white supremacy and all this other stuff, but I think it just boils down to that people tend to choose those who are like themselves and favor them more due to what you said, the hardwired group innate functions.
In-group, out-group preference is not the same as racism. Racism relies on in-group, out-group preference. The category of race would, like your race would be an in-group, another race would be an out-group, but that is not the same as racism being genetically hardwired. There's also a study where they isolated the social and historical contingency and showed that the biases people had went away. If it was genetically hardwired, it would not go away.
Okay, the argument I was originally making was that people, say white people, it's not like they're evil or something. They're just hardwired to choose one another because they look similar. That was the argument I was trying to make all along. Versus, say, choosing a black person over a white person, there are studies done showing that white people respond more to pain in other white people than in black people. So one could
You
construe that
can't,
as
you have
racism.
to, you have to isolate the social contingency in order for it to be genetically hardwired.
Such as raising the white child among black people and the black child among white people and seeing if they still choose the other?
No, you would have to take a society where there is no black and white race there, or there aren't these types of affiliations being important.
But how would the child even know what white was then? Or, like,
Right. If the child had no view of what white was, would they still be racist? That's what it would need to be for it to be genetically hardwired.
my point was just that they would like other people who look like them. That's what I was saying. Of course, they would have to recognize someone as looking like them before they would
Right.
limit.
But me liking other gingers doesn't mean that's racism.
Well, I mean, the argument I was originally making was based off of the media definition of racism, which is this whole white supremacy thing. Based on white people choosing other white people, they said that was racism, because 'cause they're not choosing black people at the same rate, apparently.
So your definition of racism is simply choosing people that look like you.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'm
that's
racist for
the
wanting to hang out with gingers.
no, I would never go off in the media's definition, but that was what I was originally arguing for because I felt it was relevant due to the current political climate.
What do you mean?
I mean, like, they think it's racist for a company to have all white people in a country that's majority white,
I
where
mean,
I think they went into indiscretion.
I don't understand the relevance of that to the proposition. Like
Well, that's why I wanted to have.
my personal view, I'm a race skeptic personally. So even the idea of race being real, I'm skeptical of.
I
Also,
just showed
after that,
people.
everything after that becomes also skeptical to me. So I think using something like that as racist, I think the left is racist too. I'm fine granting that, but that's not related to the proposition here, which is if it's genetically hardwired.
I mean, that's the point I was making via race. Like, and now, for example, now the media is categorizing English people and Nordic people together when they're not even from the same ethnicity.
So that's a little bit dubious.
Why? They're
Ethnicity is not
close.
race. We've agreed ethnicity is not race.
I didn't say no. I said the
So you're
media isn't
saying,
seeing
right,
them
right. You're
as the
saying
same
the
race.
media, hold on. You said the media was saying that Norwegian people and some other white group of people, I can't remember which one, are different ethnicities, but
No, I was saying
that's
the
not
media is
relevant.
saying,
They're the same race.
right. So I was saying the media is saying just because that the media was grouping them together as the same race, which was the point I was making in saying they're being racist even by not accepting people who say are Indian, even though apparently the US calls that the same race. But
I don't
it's literally
understand how that's related to the proposition, though. Like, even it doesn't matter if the media is being racist or not. That doesn't demonstrate that racism is genetically hardwired.
uh, I I know this whole argument was just going off based off of the media definition of race, not actually like because even you said you could even say Indians are the same race as or Iranians are the same race as the English, but the way the media is categorizing it is based off of phenotypic differences.
Right. Well, the media isn't separate from culture. The reason why the media bases it off of like phenotypic differences is because society groups race based on phenotypic differences.
Right, because
So
it's genetically
the media is just representing the common sense view of race here.
right, right. But that's like what I was thinking of when I was debating race. That's like, I guess I should have clarified that because that's what I was talking about when I said race. As the articles I posted when you suggested making a debate based on this question were based on media interpretations of race. So
I
I went
asked
into
you if you wanted to do a debate on if racism is genetically hardwired.
right. So I was
Mhm.
thinking that you had read the articles that I posted and you
I
were
did.
making
I didn't find them relevant to the proposition.
okay, I did because they clearly showed that, say, for instance, infants preferred people who were a similar, I guess, white
Right,
people
but
prefer
you
black
mentioned
people
already that like
prefer.
90% of those people, 90% of their interactions were in the same race.
Well, this they phenotypically, yes, they look
Right.
just like them.
Mhm.
But like I said, Indian, you're saying Indian is the same race as white, but I was making a
I
clarification
didn't
that
say Indian is the same race as white. My personal
you
view
did.
is races are a social construct only, and I want to just get rid of it.
Well, it's clearly been shown that we're genetically different enough to categorize
That's not the
into
same as race. That's not the same as ethnic. I'm fine with ethnicity. Ethnicity is like totally fine with me.
okay. So what
Genetic
you're going off
variation based on ethnicity is different.
it's you're saying subjectively that you are choosing to define what a race would be based off of genetic difference.
It's not a subjective definition. I'm not using a proprietary definition here. I mean, there's a great deal of literature on race constructionism. There's a whole field of philosophy on it, and I can recommend philosophers to read if you want to learn more about that.
Okay, so you're saying that, for instance, a Polish person and an Asian person, or a Korean person, let's just be specific, are not far enough apart genetically to categorize them as being part of different races? They're just part of different ethnicities?
Repeat the question.
So you're saying, for instance, a Polish person is not
Mhm.
far enough from a Korean person to categorize them as different races? They're just different ethnicities?
I am I'm skeptical of the presupposition that race exists, period. So going into like, are you saying that there's not enough difference between Korean people and this other people that they're not race? It's just it, having the same presupposition that okay, race is real. Here's the evidence of it. And then when I say I don't agree that the presupposition that race is real, you say, wait, hold on, race is real. Here's the evidence of it. That's not addressing my skepticism here.
Because it's totally subjective, it seems, for
It's
you.
not totally subjective. I'm using an institutional norm. I'm using
What
the
is
institutional norm of something like critical race philosophy here.
okay, well, I guess I'm not educated enough on this institution because I was just going based off of scientifically. They showed there were four different racial clusters.
Hold on, hold on. Scientifically, scientifically. I'm not sure what you mean by scientifically here, because it's my understanding that most of the studies around race are no longer using terms like race, and they're just going with ethnicity now.
I I mean, but I showed you there were 4 different clusters that they found, which denoted.
But that's not what I'm contending here, 394. What I'm contending here is that science as an institution affirms the concept of race, not the concept of ethnicity, not the concept of genetic clusters. That's not relevant to the proposition.
I'm so confused. So, how do we even argue what race is if you can't prove it scientifically or not?
Um, you can prove it scientifically. So if it's proven scientifically, show me. But
But I
I haven't.
did.
No, you didn't. You showed me some genetic clustering, but that's not the same thing as race. Like, what is the category of race when it comes to the scientific understanding? What's the scientific definition of race? What's the
The
institutional
scientific
definition of race?
basically people who are so genetically far apart that the ethnicities of which basically it's like a grouping of the ethnicities that are closer together and form clusters of their own that are genetically far apart from other ethnicity clusters to
Right.
denote.
I mean, you've told me this several times, but I want to see like some type of institution, scientific institution that would say this is the definition of race. That would be a race realist definition and not a social construction. I understand what you take race to be. That's not in contention here. My contention is that in
I
a
have a
scientific
specific.
institution,
I know. Okay, I know how to prove this. I understand what you're saying. Okay, 1 second. Just 1 second. Perfect. Okay. Great. I have something that you will really like.
why am I supposed to like this?
Because it shows that mixed race children aren't genetically close enough to either parent to be able to really qualify for an organ donation, which means that race is real because it's easier to find a donation for mixed ethnicity parents than
No,
mixed
that's
race
begging the
parents.
question. That's begging the question. So look, you said there are two parents of different races. So already on the table is there are different races. Then you say, okay, well, here is a child of those races, and their genetic variation means that they can accept organs from their parents or whatever. Therefore, there are two races. You had from the very beginning that there were two races already part of that argument. That's
Actually,
called begging the question.
okay, but I
So
thought you
begging
said
begging the question is assuming your conclusion in one of the premises. In one of the premises was the conclusion that there are different races.
what? I'm sorry. I thought you said you didn't believe in, you were skeptical that race existed.
Yes, I am skeptical of race's existence, but That
That's
doesn't, it's
true.
not relevant. It's not relevant to the proposition. I already said earlier in the debate, I'm fine granting its existence.
But I just proved it did exist because clearly there's a difference between two ethnicities versus two races and their ability to donate to their children via
No,
organs.
but look. Okay, you're not you're not understanding what I'm saying. I am granting races exist for the debate.
But
I
it's
am
just proved
skeptical
it.
personally. I am skeptical personally that they do it all. It doesn't matter for the argument here. What matters is that the discrimination based on race would be genetically hardwired. That's the proposition, not that race exists or not. We've gone down this like sidetrack, which isn't really relevant.
Just like phenotypically, yes, we're going to differ in how in group preference and phenotypically, clearly that's going to be a thing. Like you're
In
going to
group
be
in group preference is not the same as racism. Racism would be in group preference based on the immutable characteristic of race.
okay, well, I think already there's already in group preferences for both race and
That's
different
repeating the
ethnicities.
claim. That's repeating the claim. Look, okay, I can post something here. If it's innate, these in group preferences, right? Then these results would not be possible. Look at what I posted in chat. And I'll just read it out for everyone. What is the most striking about these results is just how easy it is to diminish the importance of race by manipulating coalition, especially given the repeated failure over decades to find other means to influence racial encoding. The sensitivity of race to coalition manipulation leads credence to the hypothesis that, to the human mind, race is simply one historically contingent subtype of coalition. Our subjects had experienced a lifetime in which ethnicity, including race, was an ecologically valid predictor of people's social alliances and coalitional affiliations. Yet, less than 4 minutes of exposure to an alternative social world in which race was irrelevant to the prevailing system of alliance caused a dramatic decrease in the extent to which they categorized others by race. Categorize others by race. This implies that coalition and hence race is a volatile, dynamically updated cognitive variable easily overwritten by new circumstances. If the same processes govern categorization outside the laboratory, then the prospects for reducing or even eliminating the widespread tendency to categorize persons by race may be very good indeed. What's important about this is what I said in my opening statement. If racism was genetically hardwired, then the results of this study would not be possible. This study was isolating the co-founding factors of society. When they did so, they found that the racial encoding went away. If it was genetically hardwired, the racial encoding would not go away.
So basically, for example, let's say like a meteorite crashed into the earth and all of the world was thrown into chaos. If people had to group together into different races, then they would forget their own racial components enough to band together.
What? I mean, possibly that could be what happens.
Is
But
that
what
like
this
the
what this was doing.
reality that you're talking about?
No, what they're talking about is that you live in a culture where you're around people of different races and you don't talk about race, and race isn't some type of issue that divides people. You just like you would see someone who has black skin as the same way that you would see someone who was blonde. It doesn't have any meaning. It's just they look different. Cool. End of story.
Well, you could argue that we kind of live in a world like that already, where people who are, where the media has been trying for a while to make people think we're all the same, or it's just skin color, pigmentation, etc. But then they still manage to produce studies where people would see others who looked
We don't
like.
live we don't live in that society though. I mean, just the George Floyd protests alone is evidence that we don't live in that society.
I'm just confused where you would find like the exact perfect social conditions where race wouldn't matter.
It doesn't
That's
matter. That's not relevant here. This study looked at cognitive biases. In the study, they basically used this type of biases test, and it was a surprise memory test. So what they did is they had photos of people, and then they had sentences next to the photos of people, and the sentences had described something to do with some type of like stereotyping, right? And then later, without any knowledge, the people had to remember what sentences correlated to what race of the person that they saw. Okay, so in one group they just had that, and they found that like they found the cognitive biases. But then in another group, they did the same test, but they gave them like 4 minutes of an alternate social reality where like they would read a story about these different races, or they would interact with people of different races, et cetera, et cetera. And in those experiments, the cognitive bias went away. If racism was genetically hardwired, that cognitive bias would not be able to go away just based on a narrative. That's what has to be demonstrated here. And this
Mhm.
study refutes that demonstration off the bat.
Okay. I mean, I can agree with you in the sense that people can reject in-group preference and choose to have higher out-group preference given the perfect social conditions. But I
It's
think,
not perfect. It's not even perfect social conditions. It was 4 minutes. That's like someone existing in an imperfect social condition, then having 4 minutes of exposure totally changes it. That's not, that is like if we're talking about genetically hardwired, 4 minutes of exposure, overcoming that, I don't see how it's possible for that to be hardwired. Hardwired here means something like I can't fly because of some type of genetic limitation of my body.
mhm.
So if it's hardwired, 4 minutes of exposure is like such a little bit of time to have an
Yeah,
impact that totally erases this cognitive bias. It seems to me like there's no possibility that it would be genetically hardwired.
so basically the argument you're making is that people only value race when they have to?
Nope. The argument I'm making is if it is genetically hardwired, then it would be impossible or unlikely for that hardwiring to change. Like my ability to fly is hardwired into my body. My ability to see is hardwired into my body. My ability to use language is hardwired into my body.
How do we know
Now,
that given this pri how do we know that given this study they simply weren't prioritizing that person due to the changed conditions, but they still favored the other people, like, on a more
if
consistent
it was
basis?
genetically hardwired, they would not be able to prefer someone else based on those conditions. Furthermore, the study is looking at cognitive biases, and the way they do that is with memory recall. They're judging the amount of time someone fails to recall something. So, just so I make it clear in the experiment, they had photos of people and they had sentences, some that were stereotypes and some that were against a stereotype, the opposite of a stereotype, paired with a photo. And then there was a surprise memory test. The people did not know they were going to be given a memory test. They were given that test and they had to match up the sentences with the photos. What is demonstrated by the study is that if someone fails to remember this sentence with someone else's race, it is done so because they have a cognitive bias about that race in their psychology. They're not trying to meet some sort of social standard in the group or please the researchers because they didn't know the test was coming in the first place. That's not possible in this experiment.
Okay. Um, I just yeah, it sounds like a great study. I just, like I really wish they would have provided, like, brain imaging or something that really could have gone into this how people's brains were working through this instead of just, like, you know, um
Memory failure test is a pretty standard way to measure cognitive biases. So just all the fMRI would do would just tell us where in the brain it's coming from. And there's a whole other discussion about like what actually is the best way to determine what's going on in the mind. And Quine has some words to say about that, where language is a better way to know what someone is experiencing rather
Well,
than
I mean,
just fMRI.
the fact that they're mixed race couples at all should tell you that obviously the ideas of racism can switch on and off via how people interact with one another. But that doesn't
Right. If it's
mean that
genetically hardwired, if it's
but it
genetically
doesn't
hardwired,
mean
that
that
wouldn't be impossible.
but it doesn't mean in general that they prefer this race over the other. It could just be that in the terms of that person that they're dating, they prefer them over someone of a different race just because psychologically, they've come to the conclusion that they want to be with that person due to bonding agents or some other kind of thing. But you can't say deep down that they're that they prefer that person's race in entirety over their own race.
That's not what I'm saying. That's not really relevant to the proposition. The proposition is if race is genetically hardwired. I've stated that the standard of it being genetic hardwired would be this. This other study shows that standard is not met. Therefore, it's not genetically hardwired.
One second. Uh, Yeah, in terms of race, I did want to say that I do think it's a very fluid kind of definition because even in Asia, they all have similar features, but Chinese versus Japanese versus Koreans, they all have still their own preferences for each other. So obviously, just to reiterate that one point, I do agree that race is such a fluid definition that
Mhm.
it's like obviously they're all of the same race, but there's still in-group preference within them that would I think race is just such a broad term that we are used to denote someone who looks physically different than us in terms of phenotypic differences, that we consider them like a different race than us.
Well, look, for the sake of argument, I can just grant that people have racial preferences. I can just grant that people encode racism, but that's not the same thing as the cause of racism being genetically hardwired. I'm saying the cause is socially conditioned.
So even though one could make the argument that even though that they look this similar, would say a Chinese child would they prefer even if they grew up in Korea, would they still prefer Chinese people to Koreans even after growing up with Koreans all their life?
Sorry, say that again.
Say a Chinese child grew up in South Korea, not North Korea, South Korea, say they grew up with them, all their
Mhm.
lives, would they still prefer Chinese people over Koreans? Like, would the phenotypic differences overrule their own preferences for that specific race?
Well, I think South Koreans and Chinese people are the same race. They're different
Yeah,
ethnicities. So even if they did prefer their own ethnicity, that wouldn't demonstrate the claim that that racism is genetically hardwired, because you would have to show the race difference, not the ethnic difference. And then the other problem comes up with, how do you know it's not ethnicity differences versus race differences? Because race and ethnicity are not the same thing. They're related, but they're not the same thing.
right. Yeah, I know, like, Slavic people are a different ethnicity, yet Polish and Germans, they look, like, basically the same, but they're different ethnicities.
Mhm.
So versus, like, say, an Arabic person is very obviously different, and a child would be more it would be way more easy for the child to identify them as being an out group versus in group for
Right.
their
Well,
own,
let me give you an example that might make this a little bit more clear. So there's this famous feral child case of this woman in Russia who was raised by dogs. Now, her behavior was like the dogs. She barked like a dog. She ran on all fours. She ate everything the dog did. She even wagged her tail like a dog. When humans realized that this child was was lost in the woods and was being raised by dogs, they rescued her. But she acted like a dog when people came up to her, running away because they weren't part of her in group.
Yes, and I agree in-group preference does matter, and obviously she's
Mhm.
grown up to recognize those people. Even though she probably could see herself, still somewhere in the back of her mind, she would identify more with the characteristics of the dogs than of the people around her just because her
Right, but
subconscious.
if racism was genetically hardwired, then this feral child who was raised by dogs and identified as a dog would be racist, would be speciesist against the dogs, and would have had the preference to be with the humans, but we didn't see that. She ran away. If it's
Yeah.
genetically hardwired, that would not be possible because genetic hardwired means it's not socially conditioned.
Mhm. I mean, yeah, that is a really great argument. I just don't know all the conditions that were in favor there. I mean, did she even know that she wasn't a dog?
She didn't have
So
language, so I don't know what she
she could
understood,
have thought she was a dog, which would mean that she,
right?
yeah, like you said, she wouldn't even know what pack essentially she was a part of. I think it would be really hard to expect someone who didn't even know that they were human to
Mhm.
align with humans.
Right, so you agree that a knowledge is required, not just something innate in humans. You need to have a knowledge of it.
I mean, yeah, you need to.
Right, if it was so if it's about this knowledge that you need, something being innate here is negated. If it's about knowledge, knowledge is something that's given to us, that's taught to us by a society. So, if it was innate, it wouldn't be a knowledge thing. It'd be like seeing color, you just see them.
Did they test it afterwards? She would prefer the dogs versus the humans?
Well, now she works on a farm in Russia. She doesn't hang out with dogs anymore.
Does she know she's not a dog, so why would she
Yeah.
prefer to be with
Yeah.
dogs when she'd be with humans? Like, could it be that one needs to be educated on what they who they even are to
Yeah,
willingly,
you already granted that
consciously
she
pick?
needs to know, right? You already if the discrimination is contingent on a knowledge or a belief, you need that information to have the discrimination. So if the discrimination is contingent on belief, then it wouldn't be innate because beliefs aren't innate. For it to be
Mm,
genetically hardwired, the belief would have to be innate. Like we're
so
just
she,
born with it.
I guess, even though she didn't even know she was a human, she still should have picked the humans anyways?
That's different though. She should have picked the humans. It's not what happened.
I just think it would be an easier, like, it would be more reliable, be more equitable if you did it a human picking humans or other humans because, like,
But okay, that's not what's on the table here. We're talking about genetically hardwired, okay? So the point of the genetically hardwired piece is that it's innate in humans. Like we come preloaded. So when a baby pops out, we're not a blank slate. I do grant that there are some things about babies that would be innate. Like I take it for granted that babies would
yeah, yeah,
seek
it's
to would have some type of like it seems to me like morality is somewhat innate. It seems to me that the
okay.
ability to learn language is somewhat innate, okay?
I have a good argument. So you say it's innate for humans to walk on 2 feet, right?
Yeah, the ability is innate, yeah.
So you said she walked around like a dog, yet instead of walking on 2 feet, which is innate to a human. So she
Yeah,
wasn't
she
even
learned how she
walking.
was able to walk on 2 feet. It was very easy for her to pick it up. And now she walks on 2 feet because it's a lot easier for her. She learned to walk on all fours because she was
When
modeling the behavior of her society.
Right, so she wasn't even using other innate functions, so how can you test whether what she was doing was innate or not, or simply just a part of learning from the pack and using their
She also,
characteristics?
but she didn't exclusively run on all fours. She
But you
also
said
walked on two legs.
sh she
So
used
all I was saying is that she behaved like a dog, not exclusively. There were some elements of her body where she would move like a human.
but yeah, she had innate functions that she didn't use anyway, so you can't say that she wasn't using a function that was innate to her because she wasn't even using others. So you can't say just because she didn't use it didn't mean it wasn't innate.
Innate here means capability. It doesn't mean you have it. So when I say that the ability to
So she
learn
could have had
language,
the
when I say the ability to learn language is innate, that is not the same thing as I just am born speaking English.
You even said
That's
the ability
different.
to not fly is hardwired, yet I bet if you grew up with ducks, you would think you could fly, or even if you grew up with ducks that could fly, then you would believe that you could fly because you would believe you were like them. So you would think when you
Believing I
were
can fly is
behaving
not the same thing as being able to fly.
right, it's based on one's mindset. So she could have had the mindset to detect that she was a different race and that she went along with other races more
She didn't
preferably.
wait, she didn't have an understanding of race. Before she was part of a group of people, she thought she was like the dog she was hanging out with.
Right, but as I said, even with the whole 2 legs thing, it could have been
The
an
two
innate
legs, look,
function. She
the
just
two
wasn't
legs thing
utilizing
is
it.
the ability to walk is innate on like our ability to walk on two legs is innate unless there's some type of dysfunction you're born with. That
Right,
doesn't
so
mean that babies can walk on two legs when they come out at 6 months. There's a process of learning that takes place.
right, so basically, she could have had an innate function that she just wasn't using because she hadn't learned how to use it yet.
The innate function is the discrimination, which I've already granted. You're saying that racism is an innate function. If racism is this innate function, it would have to be something that's not socially contingent there.
But she still had the 2 legs function, which was innate to her, but she just wasn't using it because she didn't understand even how to use it.
No, she could walk on two legs. She could stand up on two legs and walk around with the
But
dogs.
you said she preferred to move around like a dog, even though it was innate to her to
Yeah,
actually walk on 2 legs.
her preference to move around in some way is not the same thing as the ability to walk on two legs being natural. Those are different things. The reasons why she had that preference might be because like the other dogs do it and then I can sniff their butt or something. I don't know what was going through her head, but that's not relevant here.
Why is it not relevant? Because she could have had that innate function, she just didn't express it. Just like she didn't
I already said that she was able to stand up on two legs when she wanted to,
but she
but she
preferred
just preferred. Preference is not the same thing as innate ability.
so she preferred the dogs because she had learned to prefer them, but
That was her in group, yeah.
her innate function might have been to prefer the humans. She was just allowing her preference to act like a dog to overcome that. But it could have still been innate to her.
The innate function is discrimination between in-group and out-group. That's the innate function. That's not in
Right.
contention here. I said that
It
in
could
the opening statement. The discrimination between in-group and out-group can be innate. Racism being innate would have to be that type of that discrimination going on there.
I just think you'd have to separate her understanding of dogs versus humans versus herself to be able to fully express her innate want to be with the humans versus fitting in with the dogs.
I don't understand the point you're making there.
It's just we could also work this into how her mindset was conditioned, but the preference was still
Right. If
there.
it's if it's a conditioned mindset, then it's not hardwired.
Mm. But we don't know if it was hardwired or not, just whether she didn't prefer to use it, like I said earlier. You'd have to literally image her brain and see if she was expressing those traits, like, o or if she was just choosing not to express them, but if they were actually still visible in her mind when she saw other humans.
Well, we can't know what's in her mind. All we can know is where blood flow is going into her brain. The way we know what's in her mind is through her self-reporting or through her behavior. That's the best way we know of what someone is experiencing, self-reported behavior. We can look at fMRI and then make inferences based on that. But those and then the collection of all those things can add to our certainty on a topic. But I
Well, she
wouldn't say that just imaging her brain would be the best example,
we
the
just
best
don't know how her
evidence.
brain responded to the humans when she saw them versus when she saw the dogs. She could have
She ran
actually
away. She ran away from the humans. Running away is a fear response.
right, she was acting like a dog,
Hmm.
but we still don't know how innately she was.
No, we can use behavior to know what's going on in a person. Like if someone looks sad and is crying, I don't need an fMRI machine to know they're sad. If they tell me they're sad, I don't need an fMRI machine to know they're sad. We can use their behavior to determine what they're experiencing or to infer what they're experiencing.
All I'm saying is the innate function could have been present, it was just overcome by like, genetically, from birth, she could have had that preference towards humans. It was
Well,
just covered up by,
394. Do you understand my argument? Can you paraphrase it back to me?
yeah, you're
Because
basically
we're
saying,
looping.
well, this debate is about whether racism is genetically predetermined or not. And you're using a
I
case
would
where
say hardwired, not predetermined, because I would consider a social conditioning where the society has racism in it would be predetermined. You're born into that. You have no choice in it, and you're going to have the racism of your society. That would be predetermined on my view, anyways.
okay,
So
so
genetically hardwired is different than just predetermined.
she could have been genetically, hardwired to choose
Well, hold
humans. It's
on.
just her
394.
behavior overcoming it.
I just have to interject here because I'm asking you to tell me to paraphrase my argument.
Your argument was that someone doesn't have a genetic part of their brain that allows them to choose one race over another.
That's a claim. I want you to tell me my argument. Like my argument was a series of claims that led to a conclusion.
I thought that was your argument that racism wasn't genetically a part of someone, that it was socially conditioned almost.
That's a conclusion. So an argument would be like premise 1, premise 2, therefore racism is socially conditioned, not genetically hardwired.
You're saying over years and years of people choosing certain groups, they don't have this outlook that allows them to genetically, from birth, choose a certain race over another, even not by smell. Oh, I see. Okay, so you're saying basically it's socially conditioned to choose one. For example, they were surrounded by people who looked like them, right? So of course they're going to choose people who they see most of the time because they're most comfortable with them,
Three
right?
and four. I'm asking you to paraphrase my argument, and it's okay if you don't remember it. I can repeat it.
All I remember your argument in the first place was that people aren't genetically hardwired to choose one race over the other. That's pretty much the gist that I got from it. And you
That's the conclusion. I'm asking you, what are the reasons I come to that conclusion?
well, for example, there's never been a study done that's shown. You talked about the feral child thing. There's never been a study
Right. And
shown showing
what's important about the feral child thing that demonstrates my claim?
because when they were born, they weren't surrounded by people who looked like them, so they couldn't learn to choose those who looked like them instead of others.
That's part of it. Yeah. So when they were born and they were abandoned, their social behavior was they didn't adopt the social behavior of humans, which would include racism. That's part of it. Yeah. So and what's important about that in terms of it being genetically hardwired?
Because then you can't get rid of racism. People are always going to choose those who are like them, regardless of the social conditions.
That's right. If it's genetically hardwired, then social conditions wouldn't change the fact that they have racism.
Right. And I mean,
And so, the example of a feral child is a case where that's the importance of the feral child.
mhm.
And so I'm going to paraphrase your counter argument, which is if the feral child moved on all fours, but walking on two legs is innate to humans, and you grant that walking on two legs is innate to humans, then it still could be the case that racism would be innate. They just learned social conditioning that superseded the genetic hardwiring. That's your argument. That's your counter argument to that claim.
My argument was that people are just born with your with a genetically because of the whole in-group preference that people are born with the ability to choose those who are like them more than others who aren't like them.
Yeah, I understand your claim. So I was just paraphrasing your refutation to my argument for why the feral child demonstrates racism isn't hardwired. So I
Right.
want to be very clear what genetically hardwired means. I don't mean that there would be genetic factors that would be informing the actions of people, because I think all actions, even socially conditioned ones, are contingent on genetic facts. I
Right.
would need to have some type of part of my brain that could use that would be used whenever I have a social behavior. So, for example, um, my my brain has innately inside of it this ability to learn how to throw something, but I don't just have the ability to throw something. I need to learn to throw something. So, what's innate is the ability to learn to throw something. Okay. So what's innate in the human is the ability to discriminate based on physical appearance. Okay.
Well, that's an
That's where we agree. I granted that from the very beginning. Now,
okay.
for racism to be genetically hardwired, it would need to be like that ability to learn discrimination. And you would need to demonstrate that the ability to learn discrimination isn't using the same part of the brain we use for other types of discrimination and is only for racism. And that we see this in every culture around the planet. We would need to isolate the historical and social contingencies. And I showed you a study that tried to isolate those social contingencies and found that it didn't hold with something like 4 minutes. It would take a lot longer than 4 minutes for me to learn how to run on all fours.
Mhm.
It would take a lot longer than 4 minutes for me to learn how to throw a baseball or something like that, or
Right, but you
swing a
still
bat
had the
properly.
ability. Yeah.
Right. So like for it to be genetically hardwired, there's a sufficient threshold that needs to be met. Even though it would be genetically contingent, the genetic hardwiredness of it is at a higher standard than some expression of genes that are informing the action.
So similarly, would you say that the ability to walk on two legs is genetic to people, or do they just learn from seeing other people walk around them on two legs, or they would continue to crawl around because they thought that was normal to them?
I'm I don't know what you mean. Like, do I think that humans would just walk on two legs if they didn't have anyone else around them to teach them how to walk?
If they didn't see that it was something that their body was even capable of, would they even do it? Do people have to know that some things that their body are do people have to know their body is capable of something to do it?
Well, I don't know if a baby knows. Like, what do you mean by know there? It seems
Like,
to me like it would be the case that a human would learn to walk on two legs of its own accord. It wouldn't necessarily need.
why? If they didn't think it was something their body could do, why would they do it?
Well, I do lots of actions that I don't think about. Like, I breathe all the time. I don't think about that. My body just does it. When I want to stand up, I don't think about, "Hey, I want to stand up," and my body, and then I direct my body. My body just knows how to get off the ground.
Right, and I'm not
I
talking
think that
about
there
your
are certain physical I think there are certain physical actions, the way that our body fires. So, like, when a baby is like growing, they just start kicking their legs, and they start moving their legs. They start moving their limbs. They're exploring, and that's building body awareness. And I could see it very naturally occurring that the baby would be able to walk. Like, I don't think that it needs to be. It's not necessary that the baby is taught to walk, but I think it's much faster and safer for the baby to be taught to walk by the parents. I also think it would be unethical to test that, so we can't really know, and I don't really see how it's relevant to the proposition.
because of the whole feral child thing, as we talked about before.
Right,
Was
and
she
the feral child was able to walk before she was abandoned. So she was able to walk anyways. It's not really gonna answer your question.
before she was abandoned?
Yeah, she was abandoned pretty, like, she wasn't abandoned on day 1, she would have died. She was abandoned when she was able to move in such a way that she could feed herself.
So essentially, she went from preferring, obviously, her own race to her own species to another species.
I don't know what preference she had before.
You said you made the argument basically that she innately preferred the dog species over her own species. But
Yeah,
when
I
she
said I don't know
started
what she
out,
preferred.
when she first started out,
I
she
don't
might
know
have
what
preferred
I
the
don't know what she
species.
preferred before. I said I don't know what
Right.
she preferred before,
So
not
she
at
could have
the end of
preferred
being
her own,
feral.
she could have preferred her own human species before.
She could have, I don't know. I don't see what the implication is. So
Because this is
you
the
asked me the question, so she went from preferring humans to preferring dogs. I don't know if she preferred humans.
I
So I
mean,
can't answer to that. I'm just agnostic on that. It makes sense to me that she probably preferred humans before and then she preferred dogs.
so she was only preferring what was biologically helping her to stay alive. She wasn't preferring on the
But that
basis of
394,
race
that
or
goes
not.
against your argument that people would only be referring to preferring something that is socially contingent. If it's hardwired, it wouldn't be a social contingent preference.
Right, but she could have preferred humans. She just at the moment was conditioned to prefer the dogs.
Yeah, so for it to be genetically hardwired, it could not be socially conditioned. That's the argument I'm making. For it to be genetically hardwired, it cannot be socially conditioned.
How do we know how do we know if conditioning was so influential that it over became her genetic hardwiring? Because people can be brainwashed to overcome their genetic hardwiring.
Wait, hold on. We probably just have a different definition of genetic hardwire here. As I stated before, my behaviors would be contingent on gene expression.
Right,
That's
but
different than something being genetically hardwired.
meaning it never goes away? Is that that's the point you're making?
It's firmware versus software. In a computer, you have firmware that comes in the computer, and then you can load Linux on it, or you can load Macs, whatever. You can load Windows on it. The software that's being loaded on it would be the social conditioning. The hardwired part is the firmware. What's the firmware that comes in the human? The firmware that we have is the discrimination, the very fast, like, discriminating based on physical appearance. But that physical appearance discrimination can be things like clothing, can be things like haircuts,
But how much
eye
does
color.
conditioning right, right, but how much does conditioning interfere with the genetics?
I think that social conditioning has a lot to do with genetics. It has
Well,
a big impact. That's part of what expresses the gene. But look, 394, my claim here is that in order for racism to be genetically hardwired, it would have to be firmware,
so
not
brainwashing,
not software.
so brainwashing could not overcome it.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, how do we know that she wasn't brainwashed to prefer dogs over humans based on
Well,
her
look,
current?
if brainwashing can't overcome it, her being brainwashed wouldn't be relevant to the point.
But brainwashing did overcome it, which meant the brainwashing might have been strong enough to
She
overcome the
wasn't
genetic
brainwashed.
environment.
How can a dog brainwash someone? I don't understand what that would be.
I mean, in the sense that being with the dogs conditioned her to take on behaviors that she
That's
would have
not
ordinarily
brainwashing. That's not
have.
brainwashing. Learning social behaviors by being in a social group is not brainwashing. Unless you want to say like learning a language is brainwashing, and then that's a very odd view of brainwashing.
Brainwashing, indoctrination, whatever. She took on behaviors that weren't natural to her. That doesn't
Mhm.
mean like that she didn't have hard wiring before that happened. That still persisted after she learned to discard what she had learned from the dogs. She just said
I'm saying for something to be genetically
concept.
hardwired, for something to be genetically hardwired, it would be. It would be firmware on the system. You can't change the firmware. So just because you don't use so like what you're saying is it might be possible that she just wasn't using the firmware. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But that is not relevant to the other thing I cited. So these things work in conjunction, right? So now there's plausible deniability about the genetic firmware part with the feral child. That's not a silver bullet. I'm not claiming it is. What's important now is this other study that looked at the cognitive biases of people, where they were socially conditioned to be racist. They were not feral children. They were normally, and sorry, not to be racist, but they lived in a society that had racism in it. So then they're in this society. They have this cognitive bias test. They have a surprise memory failure test being applied to it. If it was firmware, we would not see the results of 4 minutes. 4 minutes being enough to change the conditioning of someone's racism.
Okay, I don't know what happened in that test, but I know that people have been put through tests where they had more empathy for those of the same race when seeing them go through challenges. And they were socially conditioned in a racist society. I guess that does that go. So basically, in order to counteract your point, okay, the evidence I found said that when people were raised in a socially conditioned racist society, they still they did prefer their own race.
Sorry,
So,
when they were part of a socially conditioned racist society, they preferred their own race.
yes, so I see how that contrasts very much so with your study that you brought up. And
How
this
does
other
that
study,
how does that contrast? Because it might be the case, that the racism in that society preferred one race over another by default. Like for example, someone who is white being raised by a black family preferring white people because society prefers white people.
that's a very generalized kind of thing to say.
You have to isolate that co-found factor.
Wouldn't the black people also prefer white people if society favored white people?
Yes, and there are studies of that.
And there are studies saying that black people will still prefer black people, even in a society that prefers white people.
Okay, so what's that study?
It's saying that's far too big of a generalization to make that society preferring a certain race means that races will respond in a certain way.
I didn't make the claim. I said you have to isolate that from the study.
I just see these two studies very much contrasting because they literally did brain imaging showing that their brains literally there was a part of their brain that was literally like
But that's
changed
okay.
to accommodate
The part of the brain has to do with discrimination, right? So if you're raised in a racist
part of
society,
the brain
right?
had to
If
do
you're raised in a racist society and you see these two races, right? And then you have an understanding that I am this other race, and the society is teaching you you should prefer your race, then someone raised by the opposite race would learn that social behavior to prefer their own race. That doesn't demonstrate that it's genetically hardwired. It could still be socially contingent, and you have to isolate that. The study I presented did isolate the social contingency. We see the reduction. I can post the study again. I can post a link to the full study so you can read the methodology.
I mean, yeah, because I haven't read your study and like I just see it directly contrasting with mine.
But I'm pointing out how yours isn't isolating the co-founding factor. So even if
It's just really weird because like yeah, I
even
would
if
just
you
have
find the even if you find someone preferring their own race, they have an understanding of being in that race. And they're
right,
being raised in a society that is telling people to prefer their race. There's even concepts about being a race traitor. So there's social pressure to prefer your race.
right. Didn't you just say the society prefers whites? Why then like
No, I was saying you have to isolate for that. It could be the case. It could be the case. It was a hypothetical.
but if society prefers whites, why do black people prefer their own? Like how
Because they would be in a society that's saying you need to prefer your own race. So there would be two things. There would be one, which is white is the superior race. And two, in order to not be a race traitor, you need to prefer your own race. Those things can exist in the same society. In fact, they exist in the American society.
well, wouldn't blacks be pressured to support whites then if the society as a
They're
whole was
pressured to support both. They're pressured to have preferences for both.
but aren't they a part of society? So how could you say society is pressured to support whites when black people are
Because
still pressured to support their own?
it's a complex issue with different subcultures having different social norms, and those things can compete. The United States is not homogenous. So while the media and movies and all of these things might present one view and that would have one impact on your social conditioning, you would also have the view of your community within the larger country.
Right, so your genetic hardwiring would still overcome social conditioning because you would still genetically prefer your own race, even if society as a whole was telling you to prefer the other race.
Society, but that's not the case that's happening here because you have two social groups telling you to prefer something that are opposite. And there's a stronger pull as a method of safeguarding in a society that is viewing your race as inferior to identify with your race so that you can find safety in that group. So even if broader society and the majority of people are saying white people are superior, black people are inferior, you should favor white people in beauty, intelligence, blah, 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 those in a subculture of a minority, in order to be safe in a society that is discriminating against it, would identify more strongly with their racial group, despite being told that they should prefer white intelligence or whatever. So those competing things can occur. You would have to isolate those factors in order to determine if it's genetically hardwired or not. So I think maybe at this point, people want us to go to a vote. So we can do closing statements and move to a vote.
Okay, I guess I can make my closing statement if you want. So basically, do, I see a lot of your points. However, I wish in the context of race versus species that feral child study had included choosing between two different races so that we could have seen how exactly race was more of a present factor rather than literally an animal versus a human. Because I think there's a difference. Obviously, humans look closer alike to each other, so like I think it would just be more conducive to our idea of choosing between different races if we could have seen how somebody who wasn't pressured growing up to choose any race at all would choose one race over the other. And I also think the study that you brought, I would have to definitely look at it and see how many participants were in it and just basically if it was a trend in other studies or not. Because I guess I haven't looked it over, so I would have to look it over and see if there was enough participation to say that it wasn't just a feature of that study, or if it was actually something that could be replicated. And I just have to say as well that I wish that we had kind of gone into more what race meant before we opened this up, because as I said, I was thinking from the perspective of what media defined as race, which is black versus white, not uh, just um, even the species example that we talked about, and just basically, yeah. But yeah, I really enjoyed this a lot, and it would be fun to debate again.
Cool. Thanks, 394. Thank you for debating. It's been a long debate, so I appreciate your stamina and your patience with me. So I just want to reiterate a few things that I think are important to the proposition racism is genetically hardwired. First of all, racism is not the same as the ability to discriminate against affiliation groups. So an innate ability to discriminate against affiliation groups is not the same as an innate ability to be racist. Second of all, it would need to be the case that race encoding, meaning people picking up on race as a feature, would have to be innate. And race here does not mean ethnicity. So you would have to differentiate between ethnicity encoding and discrimination based on ethnicity and then race. So those two things need to be demonstrated. I don't think they were demonstrated here today. The other thing that's important to note is what genetic hardwired means here. It means that it is not merely socially conditioned. It's not based on beliefs. It's something that would be innate to us. I grant that discrimination of in-group and out-group preferences would be hardwired. In order to determine if race itself is hardwired in humans, we would need to isolate from these socially and historically contingent factors. I showed a study where they did such an experiment using memory failure, when they had people pair up images of a stereotype of a person with statements that could be considered stereotypical or not. And then they had a surprise memory test, and they had to perform that memory test. When they failed, it showed cognitive bias against a certain race. Now, another group of people took the same test, but before that, they were given an alternate social reality to think about, a story where racism wasn't a big part of it, even though they grew up in a society with race. Because of that alternate story, that alternate social conditioning from the story, when they did the exact same study where race was being measured, those biases went away or were reduced. Not 100% went away, but they were reduced. Now, if racism was genetically hardwired, then a study like that would not be possible, because something like 4 minutes of social conditioning would not be enough to override a lifetime of growing up in a racist culture and the hardwired genetic fact of the body. Because we saw 4 minutes of this and this racial bias test having those results reduced, I think the evidence is stronger that racism is socially conditioned. In-group, out-group discrimination could be innate. That I'm fine granting that, but that's not the same as racism being genetically hardwired. So I think that the proposition racism is genetically hardwired has not been affirmed, and I've demonstrated why its negation should be voted for. So as you vote today, I encourage you to consider those facts in your vote. Thanks for listening.
Okay, great job, guys. I really